Daniel had nothing left. No money, no family beside him, no plan, no future. At just 29 years old, his entire life had collapsed so fast it almost didn't feel real. 1 month earlier, he still had a job, a routine, a reason to wake up in the morning. Then everything disappeared one piece at a time. First the job, then the apartment he could no longer afford. Then the phone calls stopped coming. His father had already walked out years ago. But now even his brothers were gone too, not because they hated him, but because everyone had grown exhausted trying to hold a broken life together. And Daniel had stopped fighting long before anyone noticed. Every night, he locked himself inside a tiny room that barely deserved to be called a home. A single bed, cracked walls, one weak light hanging from the ceiling like it was barely surviving too. Sometimes he would sit there for hours in complete silence, staring at nothing, feeling nothing, wondering how a human being could slowly disappear while still breathing. The worst part was not the poverty. It was not the loneliness. It was the terrifying feeling that this was permanent, that this was who he would be forever. And when a person starts believing their pain will never end, something dangerous happens. They stop trying. Daniel stopped trying. He stopped applying for jobs, stopped answering messages, stopped making plans, stopped believing tomorrow could be different from today. He moved through life like a ghost no one could see. But then, one night changed everything. It was cold, quiet, the kind of night where the streets feel empty enough to hear your own thoughts echo back at you. Daniel had been walking for almost an hour, with no destination in mind. He just needed air, needed to escape the suffocating silence of that room for a little while longer. Store lights flickered against the wet pavement as he passed one small shop he had walked by hundreds of times before. But this time, something caught his eye. A tiny piece of paper taped to the window, old, wrinkled, almost falling off the glass. Most people would have ignored it completely. Daniel didn't. He stepped closer, and written across that paper, in uneven black handwriting, were just a few simple words. 90 days. That's all you need. Daniel stared at it. Once. Twice. Again. And suddenly, something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough for one dangerous thought to finally slip through the darkness that had consumed him for months. What if 90 days was enough? What if his life was not over yet? What happened next changed not only Daniel's life, but the lives of everyone around him. Before we begin, subscribe to Lessons for Life Tales for more powerful stories that may completely change the way you see life. Every morning, Daniel woke up to the same ceiling, the same cracked paint, the same dim light hanging above him like a dying star. And every morning, for a few quiet seconds, he forgot who he was. But then reality returned all at once, heavy and cold, settling onto his chest before he had even gotten out of bed. The room smelled like dust and stale air. Clothes were scattered across the floor, untouched for days. Empty food containers sat in the corner, because sometimes even throwing trash away felt like too much effort. Outside his window, life continued normally. Cars moved. People laughed. The world kept going. But inside that tiny apartment, time felt frozen. Daniel barely spoke to anyone anymore. At first, people had tried reaching out. Friends texted him. His brothers called once in a while. Even his mother tried checking on him despite her own struggles. But hopelessness has a way of making people disappear slowly. You stop answering messages. Then you stop opening them. Eventually, people stop knocking because they assume you no longer want to be found. And the terrifying part is, Daniel started getting comfortable with that silence. Days blurred together until he could no longer tell one from another. He stayed awake late into the night, staring at his phone, not watching anything, not reading anything, just trying to escape his own thoughts. Then he would sleep through half the day, because being unconscious felt easier than being awake. He stopped applying for jobs after too many unanswered applications. Stopped making plans after too many disappointments. Stopped believing effort mattered at all. That is what hopelessness does to people. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It happens quietly, slowly, one small surrender at a time. First, you lose motivation, then confidence, then discipline, and eventually, you lose the ability to imagine a better future. Daniel was not lazy, he was emotionally exhausted. There is a difference. Deep down, part of him still wanted his life to change. But another voice inside him had grown louder over the months. A cruel voice. A voice that whispered things like, "What's the point? You already failed. Nothing is going to change." And after hearing those thoughts long enough, he started believing them. Because the dangerous moment in life is not when people fail. The dangerous moment is when they stop trying. And Daniel had stopped trying long before he ever saw that piece of paper in the window. That night, Daniel could not stay inside that room any longer. The walls felt too close. The silence felt too loud. Even the air inside the apartment felt heavy, like the room itself had given up breathing. So he grabbed his jacket and walked out into the cold night, with no destination in mind. He wasn't searching for anything. Not hope, not answers, not a second chance. He was just walking, because sometimes moving is the only thing that keeps a broken person from completely falling apart. The streets were nearly empty. Storefront lights flickered weakly against the wet pavement, while distant traffic hummed somewhere far away. Daniel kept his hands buried in his pockets, his head lowered, his mind drifting through the same dark thoughts that had haunted him for months. What happened to me? How did my life end up here? Is this all there is now? He passed restaurants filled with people laughing together, couples walking side by side, workers locking up shops after long shifts. Everyone seemed connected to something. Everyone, except him. Daniel felt invisible, like the world had quietly moved on without him. Then, as he walked past a tiny corner shop he had seen hundreds of times before, something unusual caught his eye. A piece of paper, small, wrinkled, barely hanging onto the glass window with old tape peeling from the corners. It looked meaningless. The kind of thing most people would never stop to read. But something made Daniel pause. He stepped closer. And written across that paper in uneven black handwriting were 6 simple words. 90 days. That's all you need. Daniel stared at it silently. The city noise faded into the background. The cold disappeared. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped moving. 90 days. 3 months. Could a human life really change in that amount of time? At first, Daniel almost laughed. The idea sounded ridiculous. His problems felt too big, too deep, too permanent. But the longer he stood there staring at those words, the stranger he began to feel. Something inside him shifted. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a tiny crack. A tiny crack in the hopelessness that had sealed his heart shut for so long. And through that crack came a thought he had not allowed himself to think in months. What if things could change? What if he was not as trapped as he believed? What if his story was not finished yet? For the first time in months, Daniel asked himself a dangerous question. What if my life is not over yet? Daniel stood in front of that shop window for a long time after reading those words. 90 days. That's all you need. Most people would have forgotten a sentence like that within minutes. But for some reason, Daniel couldn't let it go. The words followed him all the way home, echoing inside his mind as he climbed the stairs to his apartment and unlocked the door to that dark little room. That night, he didn't turn on the television, didn't scroll through his phone, didn't lie in bed staring at the ceiling like usual. Instead, he sat quietly at the edge of the bed, thinking. 90 days. Not forever. Not 10 years. Not some impossible lifetime transformation. Just 90 days. For the first time in a very long time, the future felt small enough to face. Slowly, Daniel reached for an old piece of paper lying near the table. He grabbed a marker and wrote one number across the center in thick black ink. 90. He stared at it for a few seconds, then stood up and taped it to the wall directly across from his bed, right where his eyes would see it the moment he woke up. That number became more than paper. It became a challenge, a countdown, a final attempt to save himself before completely disappearing. The next morning, Daniel opened his eyes and immediately saw the number staring back at him from the wall. And suddenly, The battle began. Not with the world, not with money, not with failure, with himself. Because getting out of bed that morning felt almost impossible. People who have never experienced hopelessness think change begins with motivation. It doesn't. Most of the time, change begins while your mind is screaming at you to stay exactly where you are. Daniel's body felt heavy. His thoughts immediately attacked him. What's the point? You'll quit again anyway. Nothing is really going to change. That voice had controlled him for months. But this time, something was different. For the first time, Daniel didn't fully believe it. He sat there breathing quietly for nearly a minute before finally forcing his feet onto the floor. It was such a small movement, so small that nobody else in the world would have considered it important. But for Daniel, it was enormous. Then came the second battle, walking outside, not because the streets were dangerous, but because facing life again felt terrifying. Still, he opened the door, slowly stepped into the morning air, and began walking with no real plan except one simple decision: keep going today. That was day one. And what Daniel did not realize yet was this: big transformations rarely begin with giant moments. They begin with tiny actions repeated when nobody is watching. The strange thing about change is that it rarely feels dramatic in the beginning. There was no music playing in Daniel's life. No sudden breakthrough. No moment where everything magically became easier. Most of the first few days felt painfully ordinary. He still woke up in the same tiny apartment, still carried the same fears, still heard the same voice inside his head telling him he was wasting his time. But little by little, something almost invisible began happening inside him. He started paying attention again. For months, Daniel had moved through the world without really seeing it. People, streets, opportunities, everything had become blurry, like life itself was happening behind thick glass. But now, each morning after leaving the apartment, he found himself observing things he had ignored before. The bakery owner opening her shop before sunrise. Construction workers drinking coffee in silence before long shifts. A father walking his daughter to school while she laughed about something small and meaningless. Life was still moving forward everywhere around him. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel wondered if maybe he could move forward too. By day 5, his walks had changed. He was no longer wandering aimlessly. He was searching, even if he didn't fully realize it yet. Searching for proof that life could still open a door for someone like him. Then, one afternoon, while passing a small grocery store, Daniel noticed something hanging outside near the entrance. A crowded community board covered in papers, job listings, lost pets, cheap apartments, handwritten advertisements pinned carelessly beside one another. He had passed boards like this hundreds of times before without stopping, but this time something made him step closer. His eyes scanned the papers slowly. Most required experience. Some required qualifications he didn't have. Others felt impossible before he even finished reading them. Then suddenly, one small flyer caught his attention. Plain white paper. Simple black text. Volunteers needed, just show up. Daniel stared at those words longer than he expected to. Just show up. Not be talented. Not have experience. Not prove yourself first. Just show up. And something about those words hit him deeply, because for months, showing up was exactly what he had stopped doing. He had stopped showing up for life, stopped showing up for himself. Standing there in front of that board, Daniel felt that tiny crack inside him widen just a little more. Maybe transformation did not begin with becoming extraordinary. Maybe it began with something much smaller. Maybe it began with simply refusing to disappear. Daniel reached up slowly and tore the flyer off the board. The next morning, Daniel almost didn't go. He stood outside the community center, holding the flyer in his hand, while doubt crawled through his mind like poison. What are you doing here? You don't belong with these people. You'll embarrass yourself again. For a moment, he nearly turned around. But then, he looked back at the words on the paper. Just show up. So, he took a breath and walked inside. The building was simple, nothing impressive. Old wooden floors, faded walls. The distant sound of tools clanking somewhere in the back. People moved around quietly, carrying supplies, repairing furniture, organizing boxes. Nobody seemed rushed, Nobody seemed interested in judging anyone else. And standing near a long work table was a man named Marcus. Marcus was not loud, not charismatic in the way movies usually portray mentors. He didn't deliver dramatic speeches or instantly change the atmosphere when he entered a room. But there was something steady about him, something calm, the kind of person who made you feel seen without needing to say much at all. When Daniel approached awkwardly, expecting questions about his past, Marcus simply looked at him for a few seconds and said, "We're building shelves today. Come help." That was it. No interrogation, no pity, no judgment. And strangely, that mattered more than Daniel could explain. For the first time in months, someone treated him like he was still capable of doing something useful. The problem was, Daniel had no idea what he was doing. The first shelf he touched became a disaster, almost immediately. He measured the wood wrong, held the drill incorrectly, dropped screws onto the floor twice. Every movement felt clumsy and frustrating. Daniel could feel embarrassment burning inside him. He expected Marcus to sigh, to criticize him, to regret letting him help, but Marcus never did. Each time Daniel made a mistake, Marcus quietly walked over, adjusted his hands, showed him slowly how to do it correctly, then stepped back without saying a word. No anger, no impatience, just calm guidance. And Daniel kept trying. Again, and again, and again. By the end of the second day, his hands were sore and his confidence was barely holding together. But something strange had started happening inside him. Every time Marcus handed him another tool instead of giving up on him, a tiny part of Daniel began believing maybe he wasn't hopeless after all. Then, on day 12, it happened. Daniel finished assembling a small wooden shelf entirely by himself. It wasn't perfect. The edges were rough in places. One corner sat slightly uneven, but it stood upright, solid, real. Daniel stared at it silently, almost unable to believe he had made something with his own hands. Marcus walked over slowly and examined it. For a second, Daniel prepared himself for criticism. Instead, Marcus nodded once. Just one small nod. But that tiny gesture hit Daniel harder than any compliment he had received in years. Because it wasn't fake encouragement, it wasn't sympathy, it was earned recognition. And standing there, in that quiet workshop, Daniel nearly became emotional over something most people would consider insignificant. Because sometimes people don't need someone to rescue them. Sometimes, they just need someone to believe they are still worth something. A few days later, Marcus introduced Daniel to a woman named Sarah. She owned a small food stand 2 streets away from the community center. Nothing fancy, just a tiny corner setup where workers stopped every morning for coffee, sandwiches, and hot breakfast before heading into another long day. Sarah needed help setting up before sunrise. Most people didn't want the job because it started too early and paid very little. But when Marcus mentioned it, Daniel answered almost immediately. "Yes, I'll do it." The next morning, his alarm rang at 4 a.m. For a moment, Daniel stared at the ceiling in complete exhaustion. His body ached from the work at the community center. The room was freezing cold, and outside the window, the city was still dark. Every part of him wanted to stay in bed. But then, he looked at the number on the wall. So, he forced himself up. By 4:30, Daniel was standing outside Sarah's food stand, under dim streetlights, while the rest of the city slept. The air smelled like rain and coffee grounds. Delivery trucks rumbled in the distance as he helped unload heavy boxes from the back of Sarah's old van. Bread crates, drink containers, folding tables, bags of supplies. His hands became stiff from the cold. His shoulders burned, carrying weight he wasn't used to. Sometimes he worked in near silence for hours, while the sky slowly turned from black to gray, and nobody noticed him. Customers arrived later after everything was already prepared. They never saw the work behind it. Never saw the tired young man lifting boxes in darkness before sunrise, so strangers could begin their mornings comfortably. But strangely, Daniel didn't mind. Because for the first time in months, his days had structure again. He had somewhere to be, something expected from him, a reason to wake up. And little by little, that changed him. At the end of the first week, Sarah handed him a small envelope after closing the stand for the day. Daniel looked at it quietly. It wasn't much money, not enough to change his life, not enough to erase his problems, not enough to impress anyone. But when he opened the envelope and saw those few bills inside, something hit him emotionally far harder than he expected. His throat tightened, because that money represented something much deeper. Proof. Proof that his effort still had value. Proof that he could still contribute something to the world. Proof that he was not useless. For months, Daniel had felt like a burden, a man drifting through life with nothing to offer anyone. But now, standing there under the fading evening light with that tiny paycheck in his hands, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time: dignity. And in that moment, Daniel realized something important. Money matters far less than the feeling of earning your place in the world again. By the third week, something about Daniel had started to change. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way. He wasn't suddenly successful. His problems hadn't disappeared overnight. He still lived in the same small apartment. Still counted every dollar carefully. Still carried fear deep inside him. But the man walking through the city now was no longer the same man who had stared hopelessly at that shop window weeks earlier. The changes were subtle at first. Daniel began waking up before his alarm. His room, once filled with disorder and silence, slowly became cleaner. He started folding his clothes instead of leaving them scattered across the floor. He shaved regularly again, ate better when he could afford to. Even his walk had changed. Before, he moved through the streets with his head lowered, shoulders collapsed inward like he was trying to disappear from the world. Now, little by little, he stood taller. Not because he suddenly felt powerful, but because he was beginning to feel human again. Every morning at Sarah's food stand, and every afternoon at the community center, added another small layer of confidence inside him. He was tired constantly, but it was a different kind of exhaustion now. Not the emptiness of doing nothing, the exhaustion of effort, of purpose. And strangely, that kind of exhaustion felt good. Daniel also noticed something happening during conversations. For months, he had avoided eye contact with almost everyone. Shame has a way of teaching people to look down. But now, when Sarah spoke to him, he looked at her directly. When Marcus explained something, Daniel listened with attention instead of insecurity. And people noticed. Marcus noticed first. One afternoon while they worked side by side building storage shelves, Marcus glanced at Daniel for a brief moment and smiled slightly, almost like he was quietly observing someone waking back up after a very long sleep. Sarah noticed too. She began trusting Daniel with more responsibilities at the food stand. Small things at first: handling orders, organizing supplies, speaking with customers. Nothing huge, but enough to tell Daniel something important without words. "I trust you." Even strangers started seeing him differently. The cashier at the corner store greeted him by name now. Workers at the community center nodded when he walked in. Customers at Sarah's stand occasionally thanked him directly before leaving. Tiny moments. Moments most people would never even remember. But to Daniel, they meant everything. Because when someone spends enough time feeling invisible, even the smallest recognition feels enormous. And somewhere deep inside himself, Daniel began realizing something he had forgotten long ago. Confidence is not built by motivation. It is built by keeping promises to yourself over and over again, day after day, morning after morning. Without fully noticing it, Daniel was no longer just surviving. He was slowly becoming someone new. Day 28. That was the day everything began to shift again. The afternoon had started like any other at the community center. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight, while volunteers worked quietly around the room. Tools scraped against wood. Conversations drifted softly in the background. Daniel stood near the workbench, focused on sanding the edge of a shelf Marcus had asked him to finish. And for the first time in years, he was fully focused on something other than his own pain. That was when Ruth walked in. She wasn't loud or dramatic, no grand entrance. But there was an energy about her that immediately changed the atmosphere around her. She moved quickly, like someone carrying too many responsibilities for too long. Her clothes were simple, her expression tired, but her eyes were sharp. the eyes of someone constantly solving problems because life never gave her the option not to. Marcus noticed her immediately. The two exchanged a quiet conversation near the doorway while Daniel kept working, unaware that they were talking about him. Ruth owned a small business nearby, handmade household products, shelves, decorative pieces, storage items. She had built the entire thing herself over years of exhausting work, and lately she had been overwhelmed trying to keep everything running alone. Marcus had told her about Daniel, not about his failures, not about his past, about his consistency, a man who showed up every day, a man willing to learn, a man who kept trying even after getting things wrong. Ruth watched Daniel silently from across the room for nearly 15 minutes. She noticed the way he listened carefully before making adjustments, the way he stayed patient when something didn't fit correctly, the way he fixed mistakes instead of hiding from them. Then, finally, she walked toward him. Daniel looked up nervously as she stopped beside the table. "You're Daniel?" she asked. He nodded. Ruth glanced down at the shelf he was working on, then back at him. "I need someone exactly like you," she said calmly. "Not next month, not next week. Right now." For a second, Daniel thought he had heard her wrong. Opportunity, real opportunity, standing directly in front of him. And instantly, the old voice inside his head returned. Loud, sharp, merciless. "You'll fail again. You're not ready. She'll regret choosing you. This is too much for you." Daniel felt his chest tighten. That familiar fear, the fear that had controlled his entire life, suddenly came rushing back all at once. For one dangerous moment, he almost said no. Almost stepped backward into the safer version of himself. The invisible version. The version that never risked disappointment because he never risked anything at all. But then something inside him remembered the last 28 days. The early mornings, the heavy boxes, Marcus's patience. The number on the wall. Daniel realized something important in that moment. Confidence is not the absence of fear. Confidence is moving forward while fear is screaming at you to stop. So, he looked Ruth in the eyes and gave the simplest answer possible. Yes. One word. That was all. But that one word opened a door that would change everything. Working with Ruth was completely different from working with Marcus. Marcus had been calm, patient, gentle in the way he taught people. Ruth was not gentle. Her world moved fast because it had to. Orders needed to be finished on time. Deliveries had deadlines. Customers expected quality. One mistake could cost money she could not afford to lose. Every day inside her small workshop felt like controlled chaos held together by sheer determination. And the moment Daniel stepped into that environment, the pressure hit him hard. The first week was brutal. Ruth expected precision, speed, focus. She noticed every small mistake immediately. If measurements were wrong, she pointed it out. If materials were misplaced, she corrected him instantly. There was no time for hesitation because her business depended on everything running smoothly. Daniel struggled to keep up. Some days he mixed up orders. Other days he cut materials incorrectly and ruined hours of work. Once, after misreading measurements on a large shelving unit, he accidentally wasted expensive wood Ruth had been saving for a customer project. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Daniel stood there staring at the damaged pieces while shame flooded through him. His chest tightened with that old familiar feeling, the feeling that maybe everyone who ever doubted him had been right all along. That night, he almost quit. He sat alone in his apartment, staring at the number on the wall, convincing himself he wasn't built for this kind of pressure. "You tried," the voice inside him whispered. "And now you're failing again." The next morning, he nearly didn't show up, but he did. And the pressure continued. The workshop was exhausting. Loud machinery, tight deadlines, long hours on his feet. Ruth demanded more from him every single day, and sometimes Daniel wondered if she expected too much. But slowly, something strange started happening. The pressure wasn't breaking him, it was sharpening him. Every mistake forced him to become more careful. Every difficult day forced him to become more disciplined. Every stressful moment demanded a stronger version of himself than the one he used to be. Still, there were moments when he wanted to walk away. One evening, After an especially difficult day, where multiple customer orders went wrong, Daniel sat outside behind the workshop, with his head in his hands, completely drained. Ruth walked outside and sat beside him quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel finally said the words he had been carrying inside him for days. "Maybe I'm just not good enough for this." Ruth looked at him carefully, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. People fail because they stop before discovering what they're capable of. Daniel looked up slowly. Ruth continued, "You think successful people don't struggle? You think confidence comes first? It doesn't. Growth happens when things become difficult. Pressure shows people who they really are." Those words stayed with Daniel long after that conversation ended, because deep down, he was beginning to understand something important. Comfort had nearly destroyed his life. Pressure was rebuilding it. By day 40, Daniel was no longer just helping Ruth's business survive. He was becoming part of it. The workshop that once felt overwhelming had slowly started feeling familiar. The sounds of machines, the smell of fresh wood, the constant movement of orders and deliveries, all of it had become part of his daily rhythm. Daniel no longer needed constant instruction. He moved with purpose now. Faster hands, sharper focus, better instincts. But the biggest change was happening inside his mind. At first, Daniel had only been trying to avoid failure. Every day felt like survival. Don't make mistakes. Don't disappoint Ruth. Don't lose another opportunity. Now, for the first time in years, he was beginning to think ahead again. He started asking questions about the business itself. How pricing worked. Why certain products sold faster than others. How customer orders were managed. He paid attention when Ruth negotiated with suppliers. He listened carefully when customers described what they wanted. And Ruth noticed one afternoon, while reviewing inventory lists, she handed Daniel a notebook and said casually, "Check these numbers for me and decide what we need to reorder." It was such a small moment, but to Daniel, it felt enormous. Because trust changes people. When someone believes you are capable, you begin wanting to prove them right. Little by little, Ruth gave him more responsibility. Not because she felt sorry for him, but because he had earned it. Daniel started helping organize schedules, prepare deliveries, even solve small problems inside the workshop before Ruth noticed them herself. And the business slowly improved. Orders became more consistent. Customers returned more often. Projects were finished faster. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, but the momentum was real. Ruth seemed less exhausted now. The constant tension in her face softened slightly. For Daniel, though, the greatest change wasn't money. It was stability. For the first time in a very long time, he stopped waking up afraid of tomorrow. That feeling is difficult to explain to people who have never lost everything. When your life becomes unstable for long enough, your mind changes. You stop thinking about dreams. Stop thinking about growth. Survival becomes your entire world. Every decision is controlled by fear. But stability does something powerful to the human spirit. It gives people room to breathe again. Daniel felt it slowly returning. He could buy groceries without calculating every single dollar in panic. He could pay rent on time. He could sleep without that crushing fear of complete collapse hanging over him every night. And one evening, while walking home after work, Daniel realized something strange. The city no longer looked cold to him. The same streets, the same buildings, the same people. But somehow, everything felt different. Because when a person finally finds solid ground after living in chaos for so long, the entire world begins to feel less frightening. And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe something dangerous again. Maybe his life was actually moving forward. Day 60. That was the day fear returned. Not the quiet fear Daniel used to carry inside himself. Something heavier, sharper. The kind of fear that enters a room and changes the air completely. It started with a phone call from Ruth late one evening. Her voice sounded different immediately. Tight, controlled, like she was forcing herself to stay calm while something inside her was already collapsing. "Come to the workshop," she said softly. Now, Daniel felt his stomach drop before she even explained why. When he arrived, the lights inside the workshop were dim. Papers covered the large table near the back wall: invoices, sales reports, handwritten calculations, customer lists. Ruth sat motionless in front of them, staring down like the numbers themselves had become something dangerous. Daniel had never seen her look like that before. Ruth was always strong, always moving, always solving problems before panic had time to appear. But tonight, she looked afraid. Real fear. The kind people try desperately to hide when everything they built is suddenly slipping through their hands. Finally, she looked up at him. "A corporation moved into the neighborhood," she said quietly. At first, Daniel didn't fully understand. Then Ruth explained. A massive company had opened a large retail location only a few blocks away. Same products, same type of handmade furniture and storage pieces. But cheaper, much cheaper. Prices so low Ruth couldn't possibly compete with them, because corporations survive differently. They had warehouses, advertising budgets, delivery systems, teams of employees. Ruth had herself. And within days, customers started disappearing. People who had been supporting her business for years suddenly stopped placing orders. Others canceled projects halfway through. Foot traffic slowed. Conversations inside the shop became quieter. The workshop that once felt alive now felt tense and uncertain. Daniel looked around and noticed something terrifying. The silence. No machines running. No customers walking in. No energy. Just fear. Ruth pushed the papers toward him across the table. "These are the numbers from the last 10 days. Daniel studied them carefully. Sales had dropped hard. Too hard. If things continued like this, the business wouldn't survive much longer. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel stared at the reports, while old emotions began creeping back into his chest, that familiar hopelessness he thought he had escaped forever. The terrifying feeling that life could collapse again no matter how hard you worked. And then he looked at Ruth. Really looked at her. Her shoulders were tense, dark circles under her eyes, exhaustion written across her face. This wasn't just about losing money. This business was her life. Her years of sacrifice, her identity, the thing she had built with her own hands when nobody else believed she could. And now she was watching it slowly die. Daniel realized something painful in that moment. Strong people get scared too. They just carry it silently. Outside, rain tapped softly against the workshop windows, while the two of them sat there surrounded by numbers that felt heavier than bricks. Everything suddenly felt fragile again. Every bit of progress, every step forward, every dream they had started building. One company had entered the neighborhood, and now it all stood dangerously close to collapse. Daniel barely slept that night. The numbers from Ruth's workshop kept replaying in his mind over and over again. Every canceled order, every lost customer, every sign pointing toward the same terrifying outcome: failure. He sat alone in his apartment, staring at the ceiling while rain tapped softly against the window. Weeks earlier, fear like this would have crushed him completely. He would have accepted defeat before the fight even began. But something inside him had changed during those 60 days. He wasn't the same man anymore. For the first time, Daniel wasn't only thinking about himself. He was thinking about Ruth, about everything she had sacrificed to build that business from nothing. The endless hours, the exhaustion, the years of work hidden behind every shelf and table inside that workshop. And slowly, sometime before sunrise, a realization hit him. The corporation had advantages Ruth could never compete with. They had more money, lower prices, faster systems, bigger marketing. But there was one thing they could never manufacture: human connection. That company sold products. Ruth sold something deeper. A story. People knew her. They had watched her work, watched her struggle, watched her build something real with her own hands. And Daniel suddenly understood something powerful. People may choose cheap products once, but they stay loyal to stories that make them feel connected. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the workshop earlier than usual. Ruth was already there, reviewing invoices with tired eyes. Before she could speak, Daniel said quietly, "The company can beat us on price, but they can't beat us on something real." Ruth looked up at him. Daniel stepped closer. They don't know this neighborhood. They don't know the people here. They don't know your story. For the first time in days, Ruth's expression shifted slightly. Daniel continued, "People don't fight for corporations. They fight for people." The room fell silent. And then, piece by piece, the idea formed. Daniel would go out himself, door to door, street by street. He would tell people the truth about Ruth's business, about the woman behind it, about what this workshop actually meant, not with advertisements, not with fake marketing, with honesty. At first, even saying the idea out loud sounded impossible. Daniel had spent most of his life trying not to be noticed. The thought of knocking on strangers' doors and speaking confidently felt terrifying. But deep down, he already knew something important. Growth had never come from comfort. Every important change in his life had started the exact same way, with fear, followed by action anyway. Ruth stared at him for a long moment before finally asking, "You really think this can work?" Daniel took a slow breath. Then he answered honestly, "I don't know, but I know doing nothing will destroy us." And in that moment, Daniel made another decision that would change his life forever. He was done hiding from the world. Now, he was going to knock on its doors. The next morning, Daniel stood at the edge of the neighborhood holding a stack of small flyers in trembling hands. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it. This felt different from anything he had done before. Working at the community center was safe. Helping Sarah at the food stand was safe. Even Ruth's workshop, despite the pressure, had walls around it. But this? This meant facing strangers, facing judgment directly, facing rejection directly. And no matter how much Daniel had grown over the past weeks, rejection still terrified him. He walked to the first house slowly. The porch steps creaked beneath his feet as he raised his hand and knocked. A woman opened the door halfway, clearly distracted. Daniel introduced himself awkwardly and began explaining Ruth's business, how long she had been part of the neighborhood, how hard she had worked to keep the workshop alive. The woman listened for barely 20 seconds. Then, she sighed politely. "I'm busy right now." And the door closed. Not violently, not cruelly, but firmly enough to leave Daniel standing there staring at his own reflection in the glass. Immediately, the old voice returned. "See? Nobody cares. You're embarrassing yourself." Daniel stood frozen for a moment, while shame crawled back into his chest. That familiar feeling of being unwanted, unimportant, invisible. But eventually, he forced himself to walk to the next house. The second rejection came faster. A man opened the door, barely let Daniel finish his first sentence, then shook his head impatiently. "Sorry, not interested." Door closed. Third house. No answer. Fourth house. A teenager opened the door, took the flyer without listening, then tossed it onto a nearby table before walking away. Each rejection hurt more than Daniel expected. Growth had changed many things about him, but it had not made him immune to emotional pain. Every closed door still felt personal. Every uninterested expression still reopened old insecurities buried deep inside him. And by midday, exhaustion was beginning to take over. Not physical exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. The kind that slowly whispers, "Stop trying. This isn't working. You're not made for this." Daniel leaned against a fence for a moment, breathing heavily while watching people move through the neighborhood around him. For a dangerous second, he considered quitting completely. Nobody would blame him. He had tried. Wasn't that enough? But then he thought about Ruth sitting alone in that workshop staring at collapsing numbers. He thought about Marcus opening doors for people every day without asking who they used to be. He thought about the man he himself had been only 60 days earlier, broken, invisible, convinced life was over. And suddenly Daniel understood something powerful. Strength is not becoming fearless. Strength is continuing while fear, rejection, and doubt are tearing at you emotionally. So he picked up the remaining flyers and walked to the next house. Knock. Another rejection. Next door. Another rejection. Again. And again. Some people ignored him completely. Some barely looked him in the eye. Others listened politely before saying no. Hours passed like this, beneath the cold afternoon sky, while Daniel moved from street to street, carrying hope that seemed to grow heavier with every step. But he kept going, because for the first time in his life, Daniel was learning something most people never fully understand. Pain is not always a sign to stop. Sometimes, pain is proof that you are finally fighting for something that matters. By late afternoon, Daniel's feet ached so badly he could barely feel them anymore. He had been walking for hours, door after door, street after street, rejection after rejection. The stack of flyers in his hands had grown thinner, but his hope had grown thin too. Every closed door seemed to pull him backward emotionally, dragging old insecurities back to the surface. Maybe this really was pointless. Maybe people truly didn't care. As the sun began lowering behind the buildings, Daniel climbed the steps to another small house near the end of the block. He almost skipped it entirely. His energy was gone. His voice was tired. Even knocking felt heavy now. But after a long breath, he raised his hand and knocked anyway. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened slowly. An elderly woman stood there wearing a faded sweater, her silver hair loosely tied back. She looked at Daniel carefully, not suspiciously, just curiously. Unlike the others, she didn't seem rushed. Daniel started speaking, expecting another quick rejection. He explained Ruth's workshop, how long she had served the neighborhood, how a massive corporation was slowly destroying a small local business built through years of sacrifice and hard work. The woman listened quietly, really listened. She didn't interrupt, didn't glance away, didn't rush him. And for the first time all day, Daniel felt like someone was actually hearing him instead of waiting for him to leave. When he finished speaking, silence hung between them for a moment. Then the woman looked at the flyer in her hands and asked softly, "She built all of this herself?" Daniel nodded. The woman smiled faintly. "That matters." 3 simple words. But to Daniel, they felt enormous. Then she looked back at him and said, "I'll come by tomorrow morning." For a second, Daniel almost didn't react. After so many rejections, his mind struggled to process what he had just heard. A yes, a real yes. Not pity, not politeness, support. Something inside his chest tightened unexpectedly. He looked away for a moment, because he could actually feel emotion rising in his throat. The woman must have noticed, because her expression softened gently. "Young man," she said quietly, "people still care about real things. Don't stop." Daniel thanked her softly and stepped away from the porch. But as he walked back down the sidewalk, something inside him had changed completely. One yes. That was all it took. After hours of rejection, one person believing in what he was doing suddenly made the entire day feel meaningful again. The exhaustion was still there. The fear was still there. But now, there was something stronger beside it. Hope. And Daniel finally understood something powerful. Sometimes, one person believing in you is enough to keep you moving forward when everything else is telling you to quit. That evening, for the first time since starting this journey, Daniel walked toward the next house not with desperation, but with belief. The next morning, Daniel arrived at Ruth's workshop earlier than usual. He wasn't expecting miracles. After all, one elderly woman promising support could not suddenly fix collapsing sales or erase the threat hanging over the business. But deep down, her words from the night before still stayed with him. People still care about real things. At first, the morning seemed ordinary. Ruth was organizing inventory quietly while trying not to look worried. The workshop still carried that tense silence that had settled over it ever since the corporation arrived. Daniel helped prepare materials without saying much, though both of them kept glancing toward the front door more often than usual. Then, around mid-morning, the bell above the entrance rang. The elderly woman walked in, just as she promised. She smiled warmly at Ruth, looked around the workshop carefully, and placed an order for several handmade shelves. Nothing huge. But when she spoke, her voice carried genuine admiration. "These are beautiful," she said softly. "You can tell they were made by real hands." Ruth thanked her politely, though Daniel noticed something change in her expression immediately. It wasn't relief exactly, but it was close. Then something unexpected happened. Later that afternoon, another customer arrived. Then another. One woman mentioned hearing about Ruth's business from her neighbor. A man from down the street stopped by because someone at the market told him the workshop was struggling. A young couple entered simply because they wanted to support local businesses. And slowly, almost invisibly at first, momentum began building. Not through advertisements, not through discounts, not through corporate marketing, through people talking to each other. Conversation after conversation spread through the neighborhood naturally. At grocery stores, on sidewalks, at coffee stands. The story traveled quietly from one person to another. There's a woman nearby trying to keep her small business alive. There's a young man going door to door asking people not to let it disappear. They built that place themselves. And the strange thing about true stories is this: people feel them. By the end of the week, the atmosphere inside Ruth's workshop had completely changed. The machines were running constantly again. Orders stacked across the tables. Conversations returned. Laughter occasionally slipped into the room where silence had once lived. Even Ruth looked different. The fear in her eyes had softened into determination again. One evening, while reviewing new customer orders, she looked over at Daniel almost in disbelief. "I don't understand," she admitted quietly. "Why are people suddenly showing up?" Daniel smiled faintly. Because now he understood something the corporation never would. Big companies sell convenience, but people stay loyal to authenticity. The neighborhood wasn't choosing the cheapest products anymore. They were choosing connection. They were choosing the feeling of protecting something real before it disappeared forever. And for Daniel, watching all of this unfold felt deeply emotional in ways he couldn't fully explain. Because only a few months earlier, he himself had felt invisible to the world. Now, somehow, he had become part of something that was bringing people together. And with every new customer walking through that door, the belief inside him grew stronger. One honest story can move an entire community. A few days later, Daniel returned to the community center for the first time in weeks. The moment he stepped through the doors, memories rushed back instantly. The smell of sawdust, the sound of tools against wood, volunteers moving quietly through the workshop exactly the way they always had. So much of the place looked unchanged, but Daniel knew something was different. He was different. Marcus stood near the back table organizing materials when he noticed Daniel walking in. For a brief moment, he simply watched him silently, almost like he was studying someone he already knew, but somehow didn't recognize anymore. Then Marcus smiled. "There he is," he said calmly. Daniel laughed softly and walked over. They shook hands, but Marcus didn't let go immediately. His eyes stayed on Daniel for a second longer than usual, thoughtful and observant. "You look different," Marcus finally said. At first, Daniel shrugged it off. But as they sat together, in the same corner where Daniel had once struggled to hold a drill correctly, the difference became impossible to ignore. Months ago, Daniel used to sit with his shoulders collapsed inward, avoiding eye contact, speaking carefully, like every word needed permission to exist. Now, he sat upright, confident, without trying to appear confident. The fear that once controlled every movement inside him no longer dominated the room. Marcus noticed all of it. They talked for a while about Ruth's workshop, the neighborhood, the customers returning. Daniel explained how people had started supporting the business after hearing the story behind it. As he spoke, Marcus listened quietly with that same calm attention he had always given him. Then eventually, Marcus leaned back slightly and looked at Daniel with an expression that carried something deeper than pride. "You know what changed?" Marcus asked softly. Daniel looked at him. Marcus continued, "You didn't just find work. The room fell quiet. You became someone people believe in." Daniel felt those words hit him harder than he expected. Because deep down, he realized Marcus was right. This journey had never really been about money, or jobs, or even survival. It was about identity. Months earlier, Daniel had seen himself as a failure waiting for life to end. A man invisible to the world, someone with nothing valuable left inside him. But somewhere between the early mornings, the mistakes, the rejection, the pressure, and the doors he refused to stop knocking on, that version of him had slowly disappeared. Not all at once. Piece by piece. Marcus smiled faintly and shook his head. "No one teaches that transformation," he said. "People build it themselves, one difficult day at a time." Daniel looked around the community center again, the place where everything had quietly begun, and for a moment, emotion rose inside his chest, so strongly he struggled to speak. Because he finally understood something powerful. The greatest changes in life are not always visible from the outside. Sometimes the real transformation is becoming someone you can finally respect when you look in the mirror. Day 89. That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment with the window slightly open, letting the cool evening air drift quietly through the room. The city outside moved with its usual rhythm, distant traffic, soft conversations somewhere below, lights glowing across nearby buildings. But inside the apartment, everything felt still, peaceful. Months earlier, silence in a room used to terrify him. Silence meant loneliness, failure, the unbearable weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him in the dark. Now the silence felt different. It felt earned. Daniel leaned back in his chair and looked across the room toward the wall where the paper still hung. Only one number remained, 1. Tomorrow would be day 90. For a long time, he simply stared at it without speaking. And slowly, memories began flooding back one after another. The tiny apartment where this journey started, the nights he spent feeling invisible, the mornings he could barely force himself out of bed. The fear, the hopelessness, the voice inside his head constantly whispering that his life was already over. Then came the paper in the window. 90 days. That's all you need. At the time, those words had sounded almost meaningless, just another sentence taped to dusty glass. But somehow, that tiny moment had cracked something open inside him that could never fully close again. Daniel thought about Marcus teaching him patiently when he kept failing. About Sarah handing him his first paycheck. About Ruth believing in him before he fully believed in himself. About the doors slammed in his face. About the elderly woman who said yes. About every morning he wanted to quit but didn't. 90 days, that was all. Not because 90 days magically solved life, but because 90 days of repeated decisions slowly transformed the person making them. Daniel realized something profound sitting there alone in that quiet room. His life had not changed in one dramatic moment. It changed one morning at a time, one decision at a time, one difficult step at a time, one refusal to give up at a time. And suddenly, emotion rose inside him so strongly, he had to look away from the wall for a moment. Because for the first time in years, he was proud of himself. Not proud because he had become rich. Not proud because everything was perfect. Proud because he survived becoming someone new. Outside the window, life continued moving through the city exactly as it always had. But Daniel understood now that transformation often happens quietly. The world may look the same on the outside, while an entire human being changes internally. And maybe that was the real message hidden inside those 90 days. Not that life becomes easy, but that people are capable of becoming far stronger than the version of themselves they almost gave up on. Day 90 arrived quietly. No celebration, no dramatic music, no sudden moment where the world announced that Daniel's life had officially changed. The morning began the same way most of the previous mornings had begun, with work. Daniel arrived at Ruth's workshop before sunrise, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside while the neighborhood was still waking up. The familiar smell of wood and fresh coffee filled the air. Orders were stacked neatly across the tables waiting to be completed. Machines hummed softly in the background. Everything felt normal. And maybe that was the most beautiful part of all. Because 90 days earlier, Daniel had been a man with nothing, no direction, no purpose, no belief in himself. Back then, even getting out of bed had felt impossible. Now he moved through the workshop with confidence so natural he barely noticed it anymore. Customers greeted him by name. Suppliers trusted him. Ruth relied on him without hesitation. Somewhere along the way, survival had quietly turned into responsibility. Late that evening, after the final customer left, Ruth asked Daniel to sit down with her near the back of the workshop. The room was calm now, quiet except for the distant sound of rain beginning outside. Ruth looked unusually serious. For a moment, Daniel wondered if something was wrong again. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried something entirely different. "You know," she said softly, "when you first walked into my life, you were looking for a chance." Daniel stayed silent. Ruth smiled faintly and continued. "But now, you've become someone other people depend on." Those words hit Daniel deeply because they forced him to realize how far he had truly come. Not long ago, he had been the one desperately searching for hope, searching for purpose, searching for someone to believe in him. Now people trusted him, relied on him, believed in him. Ruth leaned forward slightly. "This business survived because of you too," she said. "Not just because you worked hard, because you cared about it like it mattered." Daniel looked down for a second. Overwhelmed by emotions he struggled to explain. Then Ruth said something that completely changed the direction of his future. "I want you to become my partner." The words hung in the air between them. Not employee, not assistant, partner, equal. For a moment, Daniel could barely process what he was hearing. His mind flashed back through every stage of the journey. The broken apartment, the paper in the window, Marcus teaching him patiently, the early mornings at Sarah's stand, the slammed doors, the fear, the exhaustion, the moments he nearly quit. And suddenly he understood something extraordinary. Those 90 days had never been about finding opportunity. They had been about becoming the kind of person opportunity could trust. Ruth waited quietly for his answer. Daniel felt fear again for a brief moment. Not the old fear of failure, but the fear that comes whenever life places something meaningful in your hands. But this time, he knew what to do with fear. He smiled slightly, looked Ruth in the eyes, and answered with the same word that had changed his life once before. "Yes." And in that moment, the transformation was complete. Daniel was no longer the man searching desperately for a chance to survive. He had become someone capable of building a future not only for himself, but for others too. 90 days. That was all it took to completely change the direction of one man's life. Not because Daniel suddenly became extraordinary. Not because luck appeared out of nowhere. Not because the world finally became fair. His life changed because he made one decision, and then kept making it again every single day afterward. The decision to keep going. Months later, Ruth's business was stronger than it had ever been before. The workshop was alive again, machines running from morning until evening, customers returning regularly, new orders arriving faster than expected. The corporation was still there, still selling cheaper products, still trying to dominate the neighborhood. But something had changed that money could not control. People had chosen connection over convenience. They had chosen the real story, the real people, the real struggle behind the products they bought. And once a community emotionally connects to something authentic, that connection becomes stronger than advertising, stronger than discounts, stronger than corporate power. Daniel stood beside Ruth through all of it. Not as a man desperately trying to survive anymore, but as someone helping build something meaningful. And perhaps the most beautiful part of all was this: Daniel never forgot who he used to be. Whenever he walked through the neighborhood now, he noticed people others ignored. The exhausted cashier staring blankly at the floor after a long shift. The young man sitting alone at the bus stop looking emotionally defeated. The tired faces carrying silent battles nobody else could see. Because Daniel recognized that look. He had lived inside it. And instead of looking away the way most people do, he stopped. Sometimes it was just a small conversation, sometimes a simple smile, sometimes only a few encouraging words. But Daniel understood something now that many people spend their entire lives missing. You never know how close someone is to giving up. And sometimes, the smallest act of belief can become the beginning of another person's transformation. Marcus still worked at the community center exactly the same way he always had, still opening doors for strangers, still teaching patiently, still refusing to judge people by their worst moments. Week after week, more people walked through those doors carrying broken confidence, hidden pain, and silent hopelessness. And the doors remained open. Because Marcus understood something powerful long before Daniel ever did. Most people do not need saving. They need a reason to believe they are still capable of becoming more than their current circumstances. That is what those 90 days were really about. Not motivation, not talent, not perfection. Persistence. The hidden power of small daily decisions, repeated long enough to transform a human being from the inside out. One morning getting out of bed. One uncomfortable conversation. One difficult decision. One more attempt after failure. One more door knocked on despite rejection. That is how lives change. Quietly, slowly, then suddenly all at once. Because success is not talent. Success is refusing to stop, and maybe that is the real reason this story matters. Right now, somewhere in the world, there is someone sitting alone in a dark room believing their life has already ended. Someone convinced they are too broken, too late, too far behind to change anything anymore. Daniel once believed that too. But 90 days proved him wrong. Not because he became perfect, but because he kept moving forward long enough for a new version of himself to finally emerge. So maybe tonight, before you sleep, ask yourself one question. What could your life look like 90 days from now if you stopped waiting for confidence and simply started? Not next year. Not someday. Not when life feels easier. Now. One decision. One day at a time. That is how transformation begins. Thank you for spending your time with Lessons for Life Tales. And if this story touched your heart in any way, subscribe and become part of this journey with us. Because sometimes, one story can change a life.